The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Metropolitan Courthouse as Captain Marcus Thompson adjusted his ceremonial uniform for the last time. The gold braids on his shoulders caught the light, each thread representing 23 years of unwavering service to the Royal Guard. His polished boots clicked against the stone as he made his way through the imposing entrance, unaware that this would be the day his entire world would crumble. Marcus had been summoned to testify in what seemed like a routine case involving security protocols during a recent royal visit to the city. As the lead security coordinator, his testimony was crucial to understanding how a minor security breach had occurred during the Queen's public appearance at the cathedral 3 months earlier. The incident itself was insignificant. A photographer had somehow gotten closer than protocol allowed, but the investigation had dragged on for months, with various departments pointing fingers at each other. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past with briefcases, their voices echoing off the high ceilings as they discussed cases and strategies. Court clerks shuffled papers and checked schedules, their faces showing the weariness that came with processing the endless stream of human drama that flowed through these halls daily. Security guards nodded respectfully as Marcus passed, recognizing the distinguished uniform of the Royal Guard even if they didn't know the man wearing it personally. Marcus had always taken pride in his appearance and bearing. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. His gray hair was trimmed with military precision, and his posture spoke of decades of discipline and training. At 51, he still maintained the physical fitness required of active duty, though he had been considering retirement in the next few years. His wife Sarah had been encouraging him to step back, to spend more time with their grandchildren and, perhaps, pursue the woodworking hobby he had always talked about but never had time for. The case was being heard in Courtroom 7, presided over by Judge Harrison Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. Blackwood was known throughout the legal community as brilliant but ruthlessly arrogant, a judge who wielded his authority like a weapon and seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating those who appeared before him. His career had been built on high-profile cases and controversial rulings, and he had developed a following among certain legal circles who admired his uncompromising approach to justice, even as others quietly questioned his methods. As Marcus waited in the witness preparation room, he reviewed his notes one final time. The facts were straightforward. During the Queen's visit, a photographer named David Chun had managed to position himself approximately 15 feet closer to the royal motorcade than security protocols allowed. The breach had lasted less than 30 seconds and posed no actual threat, but protocol demanded a thorough investigation. Marcus had conducted interviews with all security personnel involved, reviewed footage from multiple angles, and prepared a comprehensive report that clearly identified the communication breakdown that had led to the incident. The investigation had revealed that 2 different security units had each assumed the other was monitoring the press area where Chen had been positioned. It was a simple case of miscommunication, the kind of minor oversight that could happen in any complex operation involving multiple agencies. Marcus had already implemented new communication protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future, and all personnel involved had received additional training. In his mind, the matter was closed, and this testimony was simply a formality. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "Good luck today. Remember what we talked about, just answer their questions and come home. Love you." Marcus smiled, remembering their conversation over breakfast. Sarah had sensed his unease about appearing in court, though he couldn't quite articulate why he felt nervous. Perhaps it was simply the unfamiliar environment, or maybe it was the stories he had heard about Judge Blackwood's courtroom manner. When the bailiff called his name, Marcus stood and straightened his jacket one final time. The walk to the courtroom felt longer than it should have, his footsteps echoing in the corridor lined with portraits of distinguished judges and lawyers from decades past. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, silent witnesses to the countless dramas that had played out in these halls over the years. Courtroom 7 was larger than Marcus had expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of natural light. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, elevated to emphasize the authority of whoever sat behind it. The witness stand, where Marcus would soon be seated, was positioned to the right of the bench, angled so that he would face both the judge and the attorneys when he testified. Judge Blackwood was already seated when Marcus entered, his black robes making him appear almost spectral against the dark wood of the bench. He was a thin man in his late 50s, with sharp features and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog and judge everything they saw. His silver hair was slicked back, and his hands, which rested on the bench before him, were pale and long-fingered, like those of a pianist or surgeon. When he looked at Marcus, there was no warmth or even basic courtesy in his expression, just a calculating assessment that made Marcus feel suddenly uncomfortable. The attorneys were already in position at their respective tables. The prosecution team, representing the Crown's interest in ensuring proper security protocols, consisted of two young lawyers who looked eager but nervous. The defense table, representing the various security agencies involved in the incident, was occupied by a more experienced attorney who had handled numerous government cases over the years. All eyes turned to Marcus as he approached the witness stand, and he could feel the weight of their expectations. The bailiff, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, held out the Bible as Marcus raised his right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" she asked in a voice that had repeated these words thousands of times. "I do," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the knot of anxiety that had formed in his stomach. As he settled into the witness chair, he caught sight of several familiar faces in the gallery, colleagues from the Royal Guard who had come to observe the proceedings, their presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him as he regarded Marcus with obvious disdain. "State your name and occupation for the record," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench but lacking any trace of respect for the man before him. "Captain Marcus Thompson, Royal Guard, assigned to Executive Protection Detail," Marcus responded, his military training keeping his voice clear and professional despite his growing unease. The judge's lips curved into what might have been a smile on another face but looked more like a sneer on his. "Royal Guard," he repeated, drawing out the words as if they left a bad taste in his mouth. "How quaint. Tell me, Captain Thompson, do you often find yourself confused about basic security procedures, or was the incident we're discussing today a special occasion?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years of service, through countless briefings, evaluations, and official proceedings, no one had ever questioned his competence so directly or with such obvious contempt. He felt heat rise in his cheeks but forced himself to remain calm and professional. "Your Honor, the incident in question was the result of a communication breakdown between two separate security units. My investigation clearly identified the cause and we have implemented corrective measures to prevent." "I didn't ask for excuses, Captain," Judge Blackwood interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I asked whether you were confused about basic procedures. It's a simple question that should have a simple answer, unless of course the Royal Guard has become so ceremonial that actual security knowledge is no longer required." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and Marcus could feel every person in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. The prosecuting attorneys exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the judge's hostile tone. The defense attorney half rose from his seat as if to object but seemed unsure of the proper protocol when a judge was attacking a witness so directly. Marcus took a deep breath, calling upon every ounce of his military discipline to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, I have 23 years of experience in executive protection, including service in 3 different conflict zones and responsibility for the safety of numerous high-value individuals. The security protocols in question are complex and require coordination between multiple agencies. The incident was minor and has been addressed through improved communication procedures." Judge Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. 23 years, he repeated mockingly. "And, in all that time, have you actually learned anything about real security, or have you just been standing around in a fancy uniform playing dress-up soldier?" The insult was so blatant, so unprofessional, that several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his military bearing in the face of such outrageous disrespect. He had faced enemy fire, had put his life on the line for his country and his monarch, had earned every ribbon and commendation on his chest through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. To have his service mocked by someone who had never worn a uniform, never faced real danger, never protected anything more valuable than his own career, was almost unbearable. "Your Honor," the defense attorney finally found his voice, rising to his feet with obvious reluctance. "I must object to the characterization of the witness. Captain Thompson is here to provide factual testimony about the security incident, and his professional qualifications are not in question. Judge Blackwood turned his cold gaze on the attorney, and Marcus could see the man visibly wilt under the scrutiny. Counselor, in my courtroom, I will determine what is and is not in question. If you have a problem with my methods, you are free to file an appeal after we conclude. Until then, I suggest you sit down and let me do my job. The attorney sat down slowly, his face pale with either anger or fear. Marcus realized that he was on his own, facing a judge who seemed determined to humiliate him for reasons he couldn't understand. He had walked into what he thought would be a routine testimony and found himself in a nightmare where his years of honorable service were being treated as a joke. Now then, Captain, Judge Blackwood continued, his voice dripping with false courtesy, let's discuss your investigation into this security breach. Did it occur to you during your investigation that perhaps the problem wasn't a communication breakdown but rather the incompetence of the Royal Guard itself? Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just hostility, this felt personal, as if the judge had some specific grudge against him or the Royal Guard. He racked his brain, trying to remember if he had ever encountered Judge Blackwood before, but the name meant nothing to him. Whatever was driving this attack, it wasn't based on any previous interaction between them. Your Honor, the investigation was thorough and objective. All evidence points to a simple communication error between two separate agencies. There was no negligence or incompetence involved, merely a gap in coordination that has since been addressed. A gap in coordination, Judge Blackwood repeated, his voice mocking. How convenient. Tell me, Captain, when you were playing soldier in your various conflict zones, did you learn anything about accountability, or was passing the buck always the preferred strategy? The reference to his military service as playing soldier was the final straw. Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure crack, felt the anger that he had been suppressing begin to bubble to the surface. His hands gripped the arms of the witness chair so tightly that his knuckles went white, and, when he spoke, his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. Your Honor, I have served my country and my monarch with honor and distinction. I have been wounded in the line of duty and have saved lives through my actions. I will not sit here and allow my service to be mocked or my integrity to be questioned without cause. Judge Blackwood's eyes lit up with what looked like genuine pleasure, as if Marcus's show of backbone was exactly what he had been hoping for. There it is, he said softly, leaning forward in his chair like a predator sensing weakness. The real Marcus Thompson. Not the polished, professional soldier, but the angry man underneath who thinks his uniform makes him special. The courtroom was dead silent now, everyone sensing that something terrible was building. Marcus could see his colleagues in the gallery looking horrified, could feel the tension radiating from the attorneys' tables, could sense the bailiff's hand moving closer to her radio. But he couldn't stop himself from responding to the provocation. I don't think my uniform makes me special, Your Honor. I think my actions do. And I think the oath I swore to protect and serve means something, even if it apparently means nothing to you. Judge Blackwood smiled then, a cold, satisfied expression that chilled Marcus to the bone. Contempt of court, he said quietly, almost conversationally. Threatening a sitting judge. I think we have grounds for immediate arrest, don't you, Captain? Marcus felt the world tilt around him. Threatening? Your Honor, I made no threat. I simply defended my service record against your unprovoked attacks. Attacks? Judge Blackwood's voice rose for the first time, filling the courtroom with righteous indignation that Marcus now realized was completely manufactured. I was asking legitimate questions about your competence, and you responded with veiled threats and insubordination. Bailiff, please place Captain Thompson under arrest for contempt of court and threatening a judicial officer. The bailiff looked confused and reluctant, but she was bound by law to follow the judge's orders. Marcus saw her hand move to her handcuffs, saw the uncertainty in her eyes, saw his world beginning to collapse around him. In the gallery, his colleagues were on their feet, their voices raised in protest, but their words seemed to come from very far away. Your Honor, the defense attorney tried one more time, his voice desperate now. There was no threat made. The witness was simply defending himself against what appeared to be personal attacks.
I must strongly object to this characterization of his testimony.
Judge Blackwood ignored the attorney completely, his attention focused entirely on Marcus. You came into my courtroom in your pretty uniform, thinking you were better than the rest of us, thinking your military service gave you the right to disrespect this court.
Well, let me show you what real authority looks like.
As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Marcus realized that this had been planned from the beginning. Judge Blackwood hadn't been asking questions about the security incident, he had been setting a trap, provoking Marcus until he could justify this arrest.
But why? What had Marcus done to earn such targeted malice?
The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the silent courtroom. 23 years of honorable service, reduced to this moment of humiliation in front of his peers and colleagues. As he was led from the witness stand, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in one of the tall windows, a broken man in a uniform that suddenly felt like a costume, his reputation and career destroyed by forces he didn't understand. The last thing he saw before being led from the courtroom was Judge Blackwood's satisfied smile, and Marcus realized that this was only the beginning. Whatever game the judge was playing, whatever vendetta he was pursuing, Marcus had just become its primary victim. And, somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that there had to be more to this story, some reason why a respected judge would destroy his own reputation to bring down a Royal Guard captain. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, Marcus Thompson began the longest walk of his life, not knowing that within hours, the truth behind Judge Blackwood's attack would surface, and the real story would prove far more shocking than anything he could have imagined. The holding cell beneath the courthouse was a stark contrast to the grand marble and polished wood upstairs. Gray concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with decades of human despair created an atmosphere that seemed designed to break spirits. Marcus Thompson sat on the narrow metal bench, still wearing his Royal Guard uniform, though it now felt more like a target than a badge of honor. His hands shook slightly as he tried to process what had just happened. In the space of 30 minutes, he had gone from a respected captain giving routine testimony to a man facing charges that could end his career and possibly send him to prison. The handcuffs had been removed once he was secured in the cell, but the red marks around his wrists served as a constant reminder of his new reality. Above him, he could hear the muffled sounds of the courthouse continuing its daily business, oblivious to his personal catastrophe. Lawyers arguing cases, judges issuing rulings, the endless machinery of justice grinding on while he sat in this concrete box, trying to understand how his life had been turned upside down so quickly and completely. The charges were serious: contempt of court and threatening a judicial officer. The bailiff who had arrested him had whispered an apology as she led him away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but bound by law to follow Judge Blackwood's orders. "I'm sorry, Captain," she had said quietly.
"I've never seen anything like this before. The judge seemed to have it in for you from the moment you walked in."
Her words confirmed what Marcus had suspected but hoped wasn't true. This hadn't been a normal cross-examination that had somehow gone wrong. Judge Blackwood had targeted him specifically, had baited him into responding emotionally, and then used that response to justify an arrest that would destroy his reputation regardless of whether the charges ultimately stuck. Marcus pulled out his cell phone, grateful that they had allowed him to keep it during the booking process. His first call was to his wife Sarah, though he dreaded having to explain what had happened. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered.
"Marcus? How did it go? Are you on your way home?"
The question hit him like a physical blow. Home seemed like a concept from another lifetime, a place where he was still Captain Marcus Thompson, respected guardian and protector, not an accused criminal sitting in a jail cell beneath a courthouse. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly despite his attempts to maintain composure.
"Something's happened.
I'm in custody at the courthouse. There was an incident with the judge, and he's had me arrested." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like hours. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was steady but he could hear the fear underneath.
"What kind of incident? What are the charges?"
Marcus explained the morning's events as best he could, though even to his own ears, the story sounded almost unbelievable. A judge attacking a witness unprovoked, baiting him into an emotional response, then using that response to justify an arrest. It was the kind of thing that might happen in a corrupt dictatorship, not in a modern courtroom with dozens of witnesses present.
I need you to call Commander Harrison at headquarters, Marcus told her. Tell him what's happened and that I need legal representation immediately. And, Sarah. I'm so sorry. I don't know how this happened or why, but I'm going to fight it. We're going to get through this.
After ending the call with his wife, Marcus sat in the silence of the cell and tried to piece together any possible connection between himself and Judge Blackwood. The name had meant nothing to him when he first entered the courtroom, and, even now, racking his memory, he couldn't recall ever encountering the man before today.
Could it be related to one of his previous security assignments?
Over 23 years of service, Marcus had been responsible for protecting numerous high-profile individuals during various events and visits.
Had one of those assignments somehow crossed paths with Judge Blackwood's life or career? Perhaps the judge had been affected by security protocols during some event, had been inconvenienced or embarrassed in some way? Or could it be something more personal?
Marcus thought about his family, his friends, his colleagues. Had someone close to Judge Blackwood been affected by a decision Marcus had made, a protocol he had enforced, a security measure that had caused problems? The targeting felt too personal, too vindictive, to be random. His phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. The caller ID showed Commander Harrison's number, and Marcus felt a small surge of relief. If anyone could help him navigate this nightmare, it would be his superior officer, a man who had seen every kind of crisis in his 30-year career.
Marcus, what the hell happened down there?
Harrison's voice was tight with concern and barely controlled anger.
Sarah called and told me you were arrested, but the story doesn't make any sense. Judge Blackwood is claiming you threatened him in open court?
Sir, I never made any threat, Marcus replied, feeling like a broken record as he repeated his account of the morning's events for the third time. The judge seemed to have a personal vendetta against me from the moment I entered the courtroom. He attacked my service record, mocked the Royal Guard, and kept provoking me until I defended myself. Then, he twisted my words into some kind of threat. Commander Harrison was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could almost hear the wheels turning in his superior's mind. Harrison was not just a military officer but a shrewd judge of character and situations, someone who had navigated the political waters of government service for decades.
Marcus, I've been making some calls since Sarah contacted me.
Judge Blackwood's behavior in that courtroom was witnessed by multiple attorneys, court personnel, and your colleagues. Several people have already reached out to express their shock at what they saw.
This isn't going to stand up to scrutiny.
The words provided some comfort, but Marcus knew that even if the charges were eventually dropped, the damage to his reputation and career might be irreversible. In their line of work, trust and credibility were everything. Once those were questioned, even unfairly, it became almost impossible to function effectively in high-security positions.
Sir, there's something else, Marcus said. This felt personal.
Judge Blackwood wasn't just having a bad day or asking tough questions. He seemed to know exactly which buttons to push, like he had studied me or had some specific reason to want me destroyed.
I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story.
Commander Harrison was quiet again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice carried a note that Marcus had never heard before, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been fear.
Marcus, I need you to listen carefully.
I'm going to send our best legal team down there immediately, but, in the meantime, I want you to be very careful what you say to anyone. Don't discuss the case with other prisoners, don't talk to guards beyond basic necessities, and if anyone tries to interview you about anything other than today's incident, you refer them to your attorney. The warning sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Commander Harrison wasn't someone who spooked easily, but something in his tone suggested that this situation might be even more dangerous than Marcus had realized.
Sir, what aren't you telling me?
I'm probably being paranoid, Harrison replied, but his tone suggested he didn't really believe that. But Judge Blackwood has a reputation for being involved in some high-profile cases with political implications. If he's targeting you specifically, we need to consider the possibility that this is about more than just today's testimony. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the duty sergeant, who informed Marcus that his attorney had arrived and was waiting in the consultation room. Marcus ended the call with Harrison and was escorted down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room containing only a table and 2 chairs. The attorney was not what Marcus had expected. Instead of the military lawyer he had anticipated, he found himself facing a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an expensive suit that suggested she was far more senior than most legal officers. She introduced herself as Rebecca Morrison, partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. "Captain Thompson, I'm here at the request of Commander Harrison. Before we discuss your case, I need you to understand that what happened in that courtroom today was highly unusual, even by Judge Blackwood's standards. And that judge has built quite a reputation for unusual behavior." Rebecca opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a legal pad covered with notes. "I've already spoken with 3 witnesses to your testimony, including the defense attorney who was present. Every single person I've talked to describes Judge Blackwood's behavior as unprovoked, unprofessional, and completely inappropriate. The consensus is that you were deliberately baited into an emotional response." Marcus felt some of his tension begin to ease. Having credible witnesses to the judge's behavior was crucial to his defense, and it sounded like Rebecca was already building a strong case for dismissing the charges. "However," she continued, and Marcus's brief relief evaporated, "there are some complicating factors we need to discuss. Judge Blackwood is claiming that you have a history of aggressive behavior, that today's incident was part of a pattern of misconduct that he was already aware of." "That's completely false," Marcus said immediately. "I have 23 years of unblemished service. I've never been written up for aggressive behavior, never had any disciplinary actions, never even raised my voice to a superior officer." "I believe you," Rebecca replied, "but Blackwood is claiming to have documentation of previous incidents. He's also suggesting that your security clearance should be reviewed in light of what he calls unstable behavior patterns." The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. His security clearance was the foundation of his entire career. Without it, he couldn't serve in the Royal Guard, couldn't work in executive protection, couldn't function in any role that required access to classified information. If Blackwood somehow managed to get his clearance revoked, even temporarily, his career would be over regardless of whether the criminal charges were dismissed. "He can't just make up documentation," Marcus protested. "Any disciplinary actions would be in my official file, which Commander Harrison would have access to." "That's true for normal disciplinary actions," Rebecca agreed. "But if Blackwood is claiming knowledge of incidents that weren't formally reported, or if he's suggesting psychological issues that weren't previously documented, it becomes more complicated. He's a sitting judge with significant credibility in the legal system. His word carries weight, even when he's making accusations that seem outlandish." Rebecca leaned forward, her expression serious. "Marcus, I need you to tell me everything about your interaction with Judge Blackwood today, but I also need to know if there's any possible connection between you and him that predates today's testimony. Any case you might have been involved with, any security detail that might have affected him, any mutual acquaintances who might have created a conflict." Marcus went through his account one more time, trying to remember every detail of the morning's proceedings. As he talked, Rebecca took extensive notes, occasionally stopping him to clarify specific points or to ask about his emotional state at various moments during the testimony. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and studied her notes for several minutes. "Marcus, based on what you've told me and what the witnesses have reported, I believe we can get these charges dismissed relatively quickly. Judge Blackwood overplayed his hand. He was so obviously hostile and provocative that no reasonable person could view your responses as threatening." Marcus felt a surge of hope, but Rebecca's expression remained troubled. "The problem is that dismissing the charges might not be enough. If Blackwood is really trying to destroy your career, he has other avenues available to him. He can file reports questioning your fitness for duty, he can make recommendations about your security clearance, he can even request psychological evaluations. As a sitting judge, especially one with his reputation and connections, he has significant influence in the system." The reality of his situation was becoming clearer, and it was worse than Marcus had initially thought. This wasn't just about a contempt of court charge that could be beaten in appeal, this was about a systematic attack on his career and reputation by someone with the power and position to make it stick. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "I've been doing some research on Judge Blackwood's recent cases and career history. He's been involved in several high-profile security-related cases over the past few years, including some that involved challenges to government surveillance programs and executive protection protocols. Marcus felt a cold suspicion beginning to form in his mind.
What kind of challenges?
Cases where civil liberties advocates have sued over security measures, where privacy rights have been balanced against protection protocols, where the scope and authority of groups like the Royal Guard have been questioned in court. Judge Blackwood has generally ruled in favor of limiting security powers and has been quite critical of what he sees as governmental overreach in protection services. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that Marcus didn't like at all. If Judge Blackwood had a philosophical opposition to organizations like the Royal Guard, if he saw them as symbols of governmental excess or threats to civil liberties, then Marcus's appearance in his courtroom might have been seen as an opportunity to make a broader point.
You think this was planned? Marcus asked. That he saw my testimony as a chance to attack the Royal Guard through me?
It's possible, Rebecca admitted. Although if that's the case, it represents a serious abuse of judicial authority that could end his career if we can prove it. Judges are supposed to be impartial, regardless of their personal views.
Using the bench to pursue a political agenda is grounds for removal from office. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus.
If Judge Blackwood had indeed targeted him to make a point about governmental authority, the judge had potentially destroyed his own career in the process. But that was cold comfort if Marcus's life was ruined in the aftermath. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. The duty sergeant informed them that Marcus was being transferred to the county jail for processing, as Judge Blackwood had denied bail pending a full hearing on the charges.
Rebecca looked shocked. Denied bail? For contempt of court and a misdemeanor threatening charge?
That's extremely unusual, especially for someone with Marcus's record and community ties. As Marcus was led back to prepare for transport, he realized that Judge Blackwood was continuing his attack even after the courtroom incident. Denying bail was another way to inflict maximum damage, forcing Marcus to spend at least one night in county jail, ensuring that news of his arrest would spread throughout the law enforcement and security communities. The transport van was waiting in the courthouse's secure garage, a stark reminder that his nightmare was far from over. As he was loaded into the vehicle alongside several other prisoners, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the van's window. He still wore his Royal Guard uniform, though it was now wrinkled and stained from the day's ordeal. 24 hours ago, he had been Captain Marcus Thompson, respected guardian and protector. Now he was just another prisoner in the back of a transport van, facing charges that could end his career and destroy his life. But, somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that Judge Blackwood had made a crucial mistake. His attack had been so blatant, so obviously personal, that it would inevitably draw scrutiny. And, when people started looking closely at Judge Blackwood's motivations and methods, they might discover secrets that the judge desperately wanted to keep hidden. As the van pulled away from the courthouse and headed toward the county jail, Marcus Thompson began to hope that his destruction might ultimately lead to Judge Blackwood's downfall. The question was whether justice would come quickly enough to save his own life and career from complete ruin. The county jail's intake process was designed to strip away dignity and identity, reducing every incoming prisoner to a number and a set of charges. Marcus Thompson stood in line with drunks, thieves, and drug dealers, still wearing his Royal Guard uniform, which now felt like a beacon advertising his fall from grace. The other prisoners alternated between staring at him with curiosity and deliberately avoiding eye contact, as if his presence made them uncomfortable. The intake officer, a bored-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at Marcus as she processed his paperwork. Thompson, Marcus, contempt of court and threatening a judicial officer, she read from her computer screen in a monotone voice that suggested she had read similar charges thousands of times before. Judge Blackwood has flagged this as a high-priority case with special instructions. Those special instructions, it turned out, meant that Marcus would be placed in administrative segregation, essentially solitary confinement, for what the jail termed his own protection. The explanation made no sense to Marcus, since his charges were relatively minor and he had no gang affiliations or enemies that would make him a target. But, as he was led to a single cell in a quiet wing of the facility, he began to suspect that this was another element of Judge Blackwood's systematic attack. The segregation cell was smaller than the courthouse holding cell, with a narrow bunk, a metal toilet, and a small window that looked out onto the jail's central courtyard. The walls were covered with graffiti left by previous occupants, names, dates, crude drawings, and messages of despair that spoke to the countless broken lives that had passed through this space. Marcus sat on the edge of the bunk and tried to process the surreal turn his life had taken. 12 hours ago, he had been getting dressed in his bedroom, adjusting his uniform and reviewing his testimony notes. Now he was wearing an orange jumpsuit with county jail stenciled across the back, facing charges that could destroy everything he had worked for over more than 2 decades. His phone had been confiscated during intake, cutting off his connection to the outside world and leaving him isolated with his thoughts and fears. The silence in the segregation wing was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps in the corridor or the distant noise of doors slamming elsewhere in the facility. But, outside the jail, a different kind of storm was brewing. Rebecca Morrison had wasted no time in filing emergency motions challenging both Marcus's arrest and his detention. More importantly, she had begun reaching out to media contacts and legal organizations, sharing the details of what had happened in Judge Blackwood's courtroom. The story she told was explosive, a sitting judge conducting what amounted to a personal vendetta against a decorated military officer, provoking an emotional response and, then, using that response to justify an arrest that violated every principle of judicial fairness. The fact that the entire incident had occurred in open court with multiple witnesses made it impossible to dismiss as hearsay or misunderstanding. By evening, news of Marcus's arrest was spreading through legal circles like wildfire. Defense attorneys who had appeared before Judge Blackwood began sharing their own stories of his erratic and hostile behavior. Court personnel, speaking anonymously, described a pattern of abuse and intimidation that had been escalating over the past several months. Rebecca's most significant breakthrough came when she received a call from David Chen, the photographer whose positioning during the Queen's visit had triggered the investigation that led to Marcus's testimony. Chen had been following news of the case and wanted to share information that he felt might be relevant. "I've been thinking about this all day," Chen told Rebecca over the phone. "The incident during the Queen's visit wasn't really an incident at all. I was exactly where security told me to be. There was no breach, no communication breakdown, nothing that required an investigation." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone wanted there to be an investigation," Chen explained. "A few days after the Queen's visit, I was contacted by someone from the court system asking detailed questions about the security arrangements, about specific officers I had interacted with, about Captain Thompson specifically. They already knew his name before I mentioned it." The implications hit Rebecca like a thunderbolt. If Chen was right, then the entire investigation that had led to Marcus's testimony had been orchestrated specifically to get him into Judge Blackwood's courtroom. The security incident hadn't been the trigger, it had been the excuse. "Do you remember who contacted you?" Rebecca asked. "A clerk from Judge Blackwood's office," Chen replied. "She said they were conducting a routine review of security procedures and needed my input. But the questions she asked were very specific, like she already knew what had happened and just wanted me to confirm certain details." Rebecca immediately began drafting a new set of legal documents, this time focusing on judicial misconduct and abuse of process. If she could prove that Judge Blackwood had orchestrated the investigation that led to Marcus's appearance in his court, it would demonstrate a level of premeditation that would make his behavior not just inappropriate but criminal. Meanwhile, in his segregation cell, Marcus was unaware of the legal and media storm building around his case. He had been given a book to read, a worn paperback novel about a wrongly accused man fighting to clear his name, but found himself unable to concentrate on the words. Instead, he stared out his small window at the darkening sky and thought about his family. Sarah would be devastated, he knew. After 23 years of marriage, she had become accustomed to the stress and uncertainty that came with his job, but nothing had prepared her for this. Their 2 adult children, both successful professionals with families of their own, would have to explain to their friends and colleagues why their father was in jail. Their grandchildren would eventually learn that Grandpa had been arrested, and, no matter how the case was ultimately resolved, that knowledge would color their perception of him forever. The shame was almost unbearable. Marcus had built his entire adult life around concepts of honor, duty, and service. He had been a role model for younger officers, a mentor to new recruits, a leader who had earned respect through consistent professionalism and integrity. Now all of that was gone, destroyed in a single morning by a judge whose motivations he still didn't understand. His brooding was interrupted by the arrival of a guard who informed him that he had a visitor. Marcus assumed it would be Rebecca Morrison with updates on his case, but instead found himself facing a man he didn't recognize, a thin, nervous-looking individual in an expensive suit who introduced himself as James Crawford. "Mr. Crawford, I don't know who you are, and I've been instructed not to speak to anyone except my attorney," Marcus said, starting to rise from his chair. "Please, Captain Thompson, just give me 5 minutes," Crawford said urgently. "I'm not here about your case. I'm here about Judge Blackwood, and I think you need to hear what I have to say." Something in the man's tone made Marcus pause. Crawford looked genuinely frightened, constantly glancing around as if he expected to be overheard despite the fact that they were in a private consultation room. "I work for the court system," Crawford continued. "Not as a lawyer or a judge, but in administration. I handle scheduling, case assignments, things like that. And I've been watching Judge Blackwood's behavior for months, documenting things that didn't seem right." Marcus sat back down, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "What kind of things?" Crawford pulled out a folder and opened it carefully. "Judge Blackwood has been requesting specific cases involving security personnel and law enforcement officers. He's been manipulating the assignment system to ensure that certain types of witnesses appear in his courtroom. Your case wasn't random, Captain. You were specifically targeted." The revelation confirmed Marcus's worst suspicions, but hearing it stated so baldly was still shocking. "Why would he do that?" "I think he's building some kind of portfolio," Crawford said. "Cases where he can demonstrate what he sees as the dangerous militarization of civilian society. He's been particularly focused on units like the Royal Guard, which he views as symbols of governmental overreach." Crawford showed Marcus a series of documents, case assignments, witness lists, scheduling modifications that all pointed to a pattern of judicial manipulation. Judge Blackwood had been systematically engineering confrontations with security personnel, creating opportunities to attack their credibility and competence in highly public forums. "But it's gotten worse recently," Crawford continued. "He's not just asking tough questions anymore. He's becoming personally vindictive, going after individuals rather than just challenging the system they represent. What happened to you today was the most extreme example yet, but it won't be the last unless someone stops him." Marcus studied the documents, his military training helping him recognize the patterns and connections that Crawford was highlighting. The evidence was compelling, showing a clear abuse of judicial authority that had been building over months. "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus asked. "Why risk your career to help someone you don't even know?" Crawford was quiet for a moment, his hands shaking slightly as he gathered the papers back into the folder. "Because I have a son who's a police officer," he said finally. "And I know that if Judge Blackwood keeps going down this path, my son could be the next one sitting in a cell like this, having his life destroyed by a judge who's supposed to be impartial." The conversation was interrupted by another guard who informed them that visiting hours were over. Crawford stood to leave but paused at the door. "Captain, your attorney is good, but she's fighting this case as if it's about what happened in court today. She needs to understand that today was just the culmination of a much bigger plan. Judge Blackwood has been preparing for this confrontation for months, and he's not going to stop with you." After Crawford left, Marcus sat alone in the consultation room for several minutes before being escorted back to his cell. The documents Crawford had shown him painted a disturbing picture of judicial corruption that went far beyond his own case. If the man was telling the truth, Judge Blackwood wasn't just a hostile judge having a bad day, he was a rogue official systematically abusing his power to pursue a personal agenda. Back in his cell, Marcus used the single phone call allowed to segregated prisoners to contact Rebecca Morrison. He quickly summarized Crawford's visit and the documents he had been shown, hearing Rebecca's sharp intake of breath as the implications became clear. "Marcus, this changes everything," she said. "If we can prove systematic judicial misconduct, we're not just talking about getting your charges dismissed. We're talking about exposing corruption that could bring down Judge Blackwood and potentially lead to criminal charges against him.
But, can we trust Crawford? Marcus asked.
He could be setting me up, or this could be some kind of elaborate trap.
I'll verify everything he told you, Rebecca promised.
But, based on what I've already discovered about the investigation that led to your testimony, his story fits perfectly. Judge Blackwood orchestrated this entire situation to get you into his courtroom so he could destroy you publicly. After ending the call, Marcus returned to his cell with a strange mixture of hope and apprehension.
If Rebecca could prove judicial misconduct, it might clear his name and restore his reputation.
But it would also mean that he had become an unwitting participant in something much larger and more dangerous than a simple courtroom confrontation. As he lay on the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling of his cell, Marcus realized that his arrest might have been the catalyst for exposing corruption that had been hidden for months. Judge Blackwood's attack on him had been so blatant, so obviously personal, that it had finally drawn the kind of scrutiny that could reveal the truth about his behavior. The question now was whether the truth would emerge quickly enough to save Marcus's career and reputation, or whether he would become another casualty in Judge Blackwood's war against the security services he despised. Either way, Marcus knew that his life would never be the same. The man who had walked into that courtroom in his pristine uniform, confident in his record and his integrity, was gone forever. What remained was someone who had learned that justice was not always blind, and that power could be abused by the very people sworn to uphold it. Outside his window, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear, marking the end of the longest night of Marcus Thompson's life. Soon, he would learn whether the dawn would bring vindication or further destruction. But, for now, he could only wait and hope that the truth would ultimately prevail over the lies and manipulation that had landed him in this concrete cell. Dawn brought no relief to Marcus Thompson's concrete cell, only the harsh fluorescent lights that marked another day in county jail. He had slept fitfully, his mind racing between the documents James Crawford had shown him and the growing realization that his arrest was part of something much larger than he had initially understood. The orange jumpsuit felt heavier on his shoulders as he sat up on the narrow bunk, wondering what revelations the new day would bring. What Marcus didn't know was that Rebecca Morrison had worked through the night, making calls, reviewing documents, and building a case that would expose Judge Blackwood's systematic abuse of power. She had started with Crawford's allegations and spent hours verifying every detail, cross-referencing case assignments with witness lists and scheduling records that painted a damning picture of judicial manipulation. By 6 a.m, Rebecca had assembled enough evidence to file emergency motions with the State Judicial Review Board and the Attorney General's office. Her documentation showed that Judge Blackwood had been manipulating the court system for over 8 months, specifically targeting security personnel and law enforcement officers for public humiliation under the guise of legitimate judicial inquiry. The breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered that Judge Blackwood had been in communication with several civil liberties organizations that opposed government security measures. Email records, obtained through an emergency court order, revealed that the judge had been coordinating his attacks on security personnel with advocacy groups that wanted to challenge the authority and credibility of organizations like the Royal Guard. The emails were explosive. In one message, Judge Blackwood had written to a prominent civil liberties lawyer, "The Thompson case will be perfect. He's been involved in several high-profile protection details, and I can use his testimony about the cathedral incident to demonstrate the incompetence and overreach of these military wannabes. By the time I'm done with him, he'll be a cautionary tale about giving too much power to unaccountable security forces." Another email, sent just 2 days before Marcus's scheduled testimony, was even more damning. "I've reviewed Thompson's file extensively. He's the perfect target, decorated, respected, seen as unassailable. When I destroy his credibility in open court, it will send a message that no one in the security apparatus is beyond accountability." The cathedral investigation was a gift that put him directly in my courtroom. Rebecca immediately shared these discoveries with the media outlets she had contacted the previous day. By 8 a.m, the story of Judge Blackwood's systematic campaign against security personnel was spreading across news networks and social media. Legal experts expressed shock and outrage at the evidence of judicial corruption, with many calling for immediate suspension and criminal investigation. The first Marcus learned of these developments was when a guard informed him that he was being released on his own recognizance and
that all charges against him had been dropped. The guard seemed as surprised as Marcus by the sudden reversal, mentioning that he had never seen someone's status change so quickly without explanation. As Marcus was processed out of the jail, he was reunited with his personal effects and his Royal Guard uniform, which had been cleaned and pressed during his overnight stay. Putting on the uniform again felt like reclaiming part of his identity, though he knew that the events of the past day had changed him fundamentally. Rebecca Morrison was waiting in the jail's lobby, her face showing the exhaustion of a sleepless night mixed with the satisfaction of a battle well fought. She quickly briefed Marcus on the evidence she had uncovered and the firestorm that was engulfing Judge Blackwood. "Marcus, you need to understand what's happened," she said as they walked toward her car. "Judge Blackwood didn't just attack you randomly. You were specifically chosen, researched, and targeted as part of a coordinated campaign to undermine public confidence in security services. The cathedral incident was just an excuse to get you into his courtroom." The revelation was both vindicating and disturbing. Marcus felt relief at knowing that he hadn't done anything wrong, that his arrest had been the result of deliberate manipulation rather than his own failings. But the knowledge that he had been selected as a target, studied and prepared for destruction like a military objective, was deeply unsettling. "What happens now?" Marcus asked as they drove through the morning traffic toward the courthouse. "Now Judge Blackwood faces the consequences of his actions," Rebecca replied. "The Judicial Review Board has opened an emergency investigation, the Attorney General's office is considering criminal charges, and the media is demanding answers. His career is effectively over." They arrived at the courthouse to find it surrounded by news vans and reporters. Word of Judge Blackwood's downfall had spread quickly through the legal community, and everyone wanted to be part of the story. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the attention, but Rebecca assured him that speaking publicly about his experience was important for ensuring that justice was served. The press conference was held in the courthouse steps, with Marcus standing beside Rebecca as she outlined the evidence of judicial corruption they had uncovered. Marcus spoke briefly about his experience, describing the systematic provocation and manipulation he had endured in Judge Blackwood's courtroom. "I walked into that courtroom yesterday expecting to give routine testimony about a minor security incident," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the crowd of reporters and cameras. "Instead, I found myself facing a judge who had already decided to destroy my reputation and career as part of some twisted personal agenda. What happened to me was wrong, but, more importantly, it represents a fundamental betrayal of the public trust that we place in our judicial system." The questions from reporters focused on the broader implications of Judge Blackwood's behavior. How many other security personnel had been targeted? How long had the corruption been going on? What safeguards existed to prevent such abuse of judicial authority? Rebecca fielded most of the questions, but made sure to emphasize Marcus's character and service record. "Captain Thompson is a decorated veteran with 23 years of unblemished service. The idea that he posed any threat to Judge Blackwood is absurd. This was never about justice or accountability, it was about one man's personal vendetta against the security services that protect our society." As the press conference concluded, Marcus was approached by several of his colleagues from the Royal Guard who had come to show their support. Their presence reminded him that while his individual ordeal was ending, the broader questions raised by Judge Blackwood's actions would continue to reverberate through the security community. Commander Harrison pulled Marcus aside as the crowd began to disperse. "Marcus, I want you to know that your position and security clearance are completely secure. The evidence of what really happened has cleared you of any suspicion or doubt. If anything, the way you handled yourself under such extreme provocation demonstrates exactly the kind of character and professionalism we need in the Royal Guard." The words provided enormous relief, but Marcus found himself thinking about all the other security personnel who might have faced Judge Blackwood's attacks without the resources or legal representation needed to fight back. How many careers had been damaged or destroyed before his case finally exposed the truth? Later that afternoon, news broke that Judge Blackwood had been arrested at his home on charges of abuse of office, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and obstruction of justice. The image of him being led away in handcuffs, his black judicial robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit identical to the one Marcus had worn, provided a stark illustration of how quickly fortunes could change.
The arrest came after investigators discovered additional evidence of Judge Blackwood's coordination with outside groups, including payments he had received for speaking engagements where he attacked security services and military personnel. What had begun as ideological opposition had apparently evolved into personal financial gain, adding corruption charges to the growing list of his alleged crimes. Marcus watched the news coverage from his home, surrounded by his family and still processing the surreal events of the past 48 hours. Sarah sat beside him on the couch, holding his hand as they watched Judge Blackwood's perp walk being broadcast on every major news channel. "I still can't believe it," she said quietly. "Yesterday morning you were just going to testify about a security procedure, and now you're at the center of the biggest judicial scandal in decades." Marcus nodded, understanding her bewilderment. The randomness of his selection as Judge Blackwood's target was particularly disturbing. He could just as easily have avoided this entire ordeal if the cathedral incident had been assigned to a different judge, or if the investigation had been handled differently, or if any number of small variables had aligned differently. But perhaps that randomness was also the key to Judge Blackwood's downfall. By targeting Marcus so blatantly and viciously, the judge had finally gone too far, creating a situation so obviously unjust that it demanded investigation. A more subtle attack might have succeeded in destroying Marcus's career while leaving Judge Blackwood's corruption hidden. Over the following weeks, as more details of Judge Blackwood's scheme emerged, Marcus found himself serving as an unofficial spokesman for the security personnel who had been targeted. Dozens of officers came forward with stories of hostile treatment in Blackwood's courtroom, of careers damaged by unfair characterizations and biased rulings, of a systematic campaign to undermine public confidence in law enforcement and security services. The investigation revealed that Judge Blackwood's corruption extended far beyond his attacks on security personnel. He had been taking payments from various interest groups to influence his rulings, had manipulated case assignments to benefit his allies, and had used his position to settle personal scores against numerous individuals who had crossed him over the years. Marcus testified before the Judicial Review Board, the state legislature, and eventually a federal grand jury investigating the full scope of Judge Blackwood's crimes. Each time he told his story, he was struck by the listener's shock and outrage at what had happened. The idea that a sitting judge could abuse his authority so blatantly was difficult for many people to accept, even when presented with overwhelming evidence. The reforms that emerged from the scandal were extensive. New oversight mechanisms were established to monitor judicial behavior, case assignment procedures were revised to prevent manipulation, and additional protections were put in place for witnesses appearing before hostile judges. Marcus took satisfaction in knowing that his ordeal had led to changes that would protect others from similar abuse. Judge Blackwood was eventually sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple charges of corruption, civil rights violations, and abuse of office. At his sentencing, he offered no apology to Marcus or the other victims of his schemes, maintaining that his actions had been motivated by legitimate concerns about governmental overreach. The judge's lack of remorse only reinforced Marcus's belief that the man had never seen his targets as real people with lives and families that could be destroyed by his actions. To Judge Blackwood, Marcus and the others had been merely symbols to be attacked, obstacles to be removed in pursuit of his ideological and financial goals. Marcus returned to his duties with the Royal Guard, but found that his perspective on service had been fundamentally changed by his experience. He had always understood intellectually that their work involved risks and sacrifices, but he had never considered the possibility that the greatest threat might come not from criminals or terrorists but from the very system they were sworn to protect. He began speaking at training academies and professional conferences, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the importance of integrity and the dangers of unchecked power. His message was simple: the uniform and oath of service were not guarantees of protection from those who would abuse their authority for personal gain. The irony was not lost on him that Judge Blackwood's attack had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened his commitment to service. By trying to destroy his faith in the justice system, the judge had instead deepened his understanding of why that system needed honest, principled people to make it work properly. On the anniversary of his arrest, Marcus returned to the courthouse where his ordeal had begun. The building looked the same, but Courtroom 7 now bore a plaque commemorating the judicial reforms that had emerged from the Blackwood scandal. Marcus stood before the plaque for several minutes, reading the names of all the victims whose courage in coming forward had helped expose the truth. His own name was listed among them, but Marcus knew that his real legacy would not be as a victim of corruption but as someone who had faced injustice and refused to be broken by it. Judge Blackwood had tried to turn him into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked security power. Instead, Marcus had become a symbol of resilience and the ultimate triumph of truth over manipulation. As he left the courthouse that day, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from respected captain to jail cell to judicial reform advocate. He had learned that justice was not always guaranteed, that power could be abused by those entrusted with it, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons but with evidence and determination. The man who walked out of that courthouse was different from the one who had entered it a year earlier. He was warier, more skeptical of authority, and more aware of the fragility of the institutions he served. But he was also stronger, more resolved in his commitment to justice, and more appreciative of the colleagues and family who had stood by him during his darkest hour. Judge Blackwood's attempt to destroy Captain Marcus Thompson had ultimately revealed the corruption at the heart of his own career. In trying to make Marcus a cautionary tale, the judge had instead written his own epitaph, becoming a permanent reminder of what happens when power is divorced from principle and authority is used for personal rather than public benefit. The story ended not with Marcus's destruction, as Judge Blackwood had planned, but with his vindication and the judge's downfall, a reminder that truth, however buried or manipulated, has a way of eventually emerging into the light.